Welcome, everybody, to the Meet the Editor session. It's going to be a very exciting time that we have created for the first time at EACR 2020. As you can see, we decided to go live with editors from top cancer journals. They have agreed very kindly to join. We're very grateful to them. Together with me is Caroline Dive. She will co-chair this session. And I will kindly ask the editors now to go briefly around and introduce themselves. And then I will say a few words on how we're going to do this. Yevgenia, maybe you can start.
Sure. My name is Yevgenia Nusinovich, and I'm a senior editor at Science Translational Medicine.
Imei?
We can't.
We can hear you, Imei, for whatever reason. Interesting.
No.
Maybe we can go to Roshan and then we'll see if we can fix you. Sorry.
Okay, hi, my name is Roshan Ahmed, and I'm an editor at Genome Medicine who's primarily responsible for the cancer content.
Okay, Javier?
Hello, I'm Javier Carmona, and I work as a deputy editor for Nature Medicine.
And Sarah?
I'm Sarah Hamilton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Cell Reports Medicine.
Alexia?
Hi, I'm Alexia Ileana Zarmadidu, and I'm the chief editor of Nature Cancer.
And Steve?
Steve Mao, editor-in-chief of Cancer Cells. Very happy to be here.
And then let's see if Imei we can hear you now. Try again. No.
No.
That's weird. We cannot hear you. I don't know why. Well, this is what happens when you go live. So what I recommend we'll do is maybe you can try, Imei, you can try to reconnect. And in the meantime, I will say a few words. No worries. We're going to fix this. So first of all, let me thank you again for making the time. Publishing is critical to science in many ways, for reproducibility, for rigorous science, but it's also very important, and we all realize that is at the center, publishing is at the center of many careers. The careers of the junior colleagues that are listening. We have people connected from all over the world. On average, there are over 1,300 participants, so hopefully they are listening from all over the world. And also the role of the editors has changed, and we were discussing with Caroline that this session would not have been possible a few years ago. When I was a postdoc, it would have been really scary or nearly impossible to have something like this, so that's fantastic. And we have to thank you because you are much closer to us. Well, there are several aspects of publishing that have changed as well, and we will discuss this. And most importantly, this will be a forum for all the attendees to ask questions directly to them. These are the questions that I myself sometimes don't dare to ask, but I will dare today. And so start to prepare your questions. You can write them in the chat box, and as for the other sessions, we will read them out and ask them to the editors. And in the meantime, we will go around with a round of introduction. And this time it will be a little longer. Every editor will introduce the journal, the scope, or the mission, whatever they feel it's important. They have a few minutes to do that. And in the meantime, again, whatever question you would like to ask, please feel free to go. And then I will simply follow the order that we followed before. I think it makes sense for the go around. And hopefully Imei will join us again. So Yevgenia, if you could go first, thanks.
Thank you. So I'm Yevgenia Nusinovich from Science Translational Medicine, which is a relatively new journal that's been around for 10 years now. It's a sister journal of science, and our mission has always been to publish what's at the cutting edge of translational research for each field. What that means to us is things that are right near the transition between the preclinical and the clinical scenes, and potentially on both sides of it. So most of what we publish is direct translational research. So in other words, things that are in the lab, but making their way into people, new treatments, new diagnostics, etc. We do publish occasional reverse translational studies, which are papers that take observations found in human patients, for example, unexpected drug side effects and things like that, and going back to the preclinical setting to figure out what's happening and how to explain them. And occasionally we also publish studies on human disease biology, but the majority is direct translational work. And that can be preclinical, early clinical, or both. But if it's preclinical, we look for it to have at least some component of human work or some clear connection so that we know it's not just an observation about mouse biology, but something relevant to patients. And conversely, if it's a clinical study, we look for scientific insights more than just a descriptive listing of doses and side effects, for example. And we've tried to stay as close to that mission as possible. So we haven't really changed the scope over time, but the scope does vary by discipline because we try to be at the translational cutting edge of each discipline. So the biggest area that I handle is cancer, but I also handle occasional papers in reproductive biology, for example. And the expectations for these fields are different just because there's so much exciting translational research going on in oncology specifically. So we try to set the standard for each field relative to that field. And cancer is our largest area, and we're always interested in the hottest new papers in this field, of course. And the only slight adjustment to what we're looking for is that we are now trying to look for somewhat more clinical papers. That does not mean that we're not also looking for the preclinical ones, but we're slightly expanding into the clinical side. But again, only for things that offer new scientific insights.
Thank you, Evgenia. I already learned a few things that I didn't know, that you also handle papers beyond the oncology. So that's very exciting. I hear that through the chat that Ime is able to hear us. Ime, can you hear us? No, but we can still see you. It's okay. Keep trying. And then thank you again, Evgenia. We move to Roshan, and we are on. Yeah.
Okay, so my journal is Genome Medicine. A bit about us: we're part of the BMC brand of Springer Nature. We're a broad, open access, broad interest genomics journal, and we pretty much seek to bridge the gaps between basic, translational, and clinical research. And we publish on a wide range of topics, and this is included but not limited to cancer, immunology, microbiome, infectious disease, neurogenomics, and single cell. And of these topics, cancer is actually our largest. And this accounts for most of the submissions as well as most of our published content. So for everyone here, you are our biggest community, so thanks. We're also looking to expand within the cancer field, and currently we are looking to publish a lot more content in precision cancer medicine, cancer metabolism, clonal evolution, immunology, immunotherapy, and circulating tumor DNA or cells. So if you have anything on this, please get in contact. We're also, we kind of cover all the space in the disease prevention cycle. So anything from kind of basic biology mechanisms to clinical therapeutics and treatment. So it doesn't have to be kind of primarily like clinical work. It can also be basic biology as long as it involves genetics and genomics. Kind of some history, I guess we've been around for about 10 years as of last year now. We're a well-established journal. We're supported by a great editorial board, including Alberto Vardelli.
I should have declared my conflict then.
And currently we're experiencing a great period of growth. So I'm really excited to be at the journal right now. And we're also leading kind of the open access movement. We're the first clinical genomics journal to be open access. Yeah, I think that's all.
Oh, that's great. I think as much as informal as this can be, it's great. So I like it very much. Thank you. And Ime, please try to speak whenever you want. And if we can hear you, we'll let you in and let you introduce yourself. Thank you again. And so we move to Sarah now. Yeah.
Hi, yes, thanks again for the invitation. So as I said, I'm Sarah Hamilton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Cell Reports Medicine. So this is a new journal at Cell Press. It's meant to be a sister of sorts to Cell Reports. So where Cell Reports is really interested in basic discoveries, Cell Reports Medicine is really the translational and clinical sister to that. Like my colleagues at Science Translational Medicine, we are interested in primarily this direct translational work. So still in preclinical models, but taking your basic discoveries and really trying to understand the context in which it works, for example. We are looking for, of course, human relevance. We don't necessarily need human data, but we want to understand how it's actually relevant to human health and disease. But we are also interested in clinical work. So, you know, early clinical trials, things like that. Epidemiology is also interesting. And then health. So not just disease, not just clinic, but understanding human health is an important part of our scope as well. So the goal really is to provide a centralized forum, so where scientists and clinicians can find important advances in their field. Cancer is, of course, as I said, we're broad, so cancer is part of our scope. It's an important part of our scope, but it is only part of it. So our scope really encompasses the entire spectrum of clinical disciplines. We are a team of 3 right now, full-time professional editors. We're based in the US and in Amsterdam currently, but our team is growing. And we do have an advisory board, so of really established and up-and-coming scientists and clinicians, and you know, they've helped us develop our scope to some extent, and they advise us on different things when we need it. And then we are a gold open access journal, so we are your open access translational and clinical venue at Cell Press.
Thank you. That was really clear. Again, Ime, if you join and you want to talk anytime, just try to speak, and we'll try to let you in. Javier, please.
Hi. So I'm working for Nature Medicine, where I handle research manuscripts within cancer and artificial intelligence, which is a pretty significant portion of what we do, what we publish. At the journal, we're a team of 8 editors, and I should say we have an open editor position for anyone interested. I'd be happy to talk to anyone. So Nature Medicine, we just recently celebrated our 25th anniversary. We are a multidisciplinary journal that aims to publish advances that might contribute to the understanding and management of human disease, and in cancer specifically, but also in other areas at the journal. In the past couple of years, we have strived to expand the editorial scope of the journal to studies that bridge the gap between translation and clinical application. And we have begun to publish clinical trials. To do so, we have had specific training, and I have also implemented clinical research guidelines that have also been rolled out to other journals within the Nature family. The type of clinical trials that we feature are generally early phase trials that often have a translational component and provide evidence not only of efficacy to support further testing of a specific intervention, but also translational data that provide insight for understanding the pathophysiology of the disease, or uncover biomarkers to refine patient certification, or also that showcase novel advances in clinical research, such as illustrating the value of precision medicine, or novel models of clinical research, such as patient-partner research that we have published on this topic recently. In addition to clinical research, we are also interested in studies that apply high-dimensional approaches to provide a more detailed analysis and overview of human samples, or work that uncover and test novel therapeutic modalities. So that's, in general, a bit of an overview of the scope of the journal. We have a broad scope focused on human disease and aiming to advance and improve the management of patients in a clinical context.
Thank you, Javier. Yeah, very good. Thanks. And Alexia, please.
Thank you. So I'm the chief editor of Nature Cancer, the newest edition in the Nature Research Journals. We launched the journal in January, so our 6th issue will come out this Monday, actually. I have been a cancer editor at the Nature journals for many years. It's going to be 10 years this summer. And the most exciting thing that has happened to me in this decade was to be able to lead the launch of Nature Cancer. It must be the most discussed journal internally in our family of journals in terms of whether we should launch it and when we should launch it. And in the end, what drove our decision was the fact that this field is really exploding with amazing high quality research. And even though our existing journals have been doing a fantastic job in terms of covering the cancer field within their broad scopes, we were lacking a journal that would be a dedicated home for the whole field. So as Javier mentioned, for example, Nature Medicine has a very broad scope. It covers a big part of cancer, but it doesn't address the full scope. The same with my old journal, Nature Cell Biology, the same with Nature Genetics. So the goal of Nature Cancer was to complement our existing portfolio and to embrace the breadth of the cancer field. So the scope of the journal covers everything from the preclinical foundational science that addresses the mechanisms underlying tumor formation, cancer progression, all the way to therapy, translational research, and clinical work. I'm also very excited by the fact that part of our vision is to provide a forum for this field that is very multidisciplinary to see each other's challenges and the exciting things that are happening in different areas of the field. So we want to get more of a discussion going through the journal. And we do this by having a dedicated front part of the journal that covers, apart from the classic perspective, also many opinion pieces. We like to editorialize as well about important things that are happening in this field. And in general, if I need to say what the journal is about in a nutshell, I would like this journal to be the go-to place for this field to not only read the most exciting and striking and interesting work in cancer research, but also to communicate with each other and understand how we can all work together to address these issues in cancer research better.
Thank you. That is an interesting point as well, the concept of being able to work together. And many of you have also mentioned human relevance. I think we'll go back to that and to clinical aspects of publishing. And again, Imei, if you want to try. Otherwise, we go to Steve. Imei, can you try to speak again? No, we cannot hear you. I think there must be a problem at your end, unfortunately. If you could try to change either the computer or something, I'm not sure. Sorry about that, but Steve, please.
So Cancer Cell was founded in 2002. So over the last almost 2 decades, our journal has been dedicated to serve cancer and oncology communities. And we were very honored to publish the most exciting and inspirational studies in this field, and we are trying our best to keep serving this community, to keep publishing the most exciting research. I joined Cancer Cell team just a few months ago, and I just found in the last several months, reading cancer papers is really fun. It's complex, it's exciting, and more importantly, it's very relevant to our health. So I cannot think of a better journal to work with, to a better community to interact with. So Cancer Cell has been very strong in terms of publishing the discovery science. Because of the name Cancer Cell, so Cell actually, because we're part of the Cell Press, so a lot of people think that Cancer Cell only publish cell biology. So this is not true. So in the last several years, we started to branch out into translational and clinical space, and we are going to keep doing that. we are going to expand our scope even further. So we understand that if you work on a discovery side, a basic side, you may not have clinical data, which is totally fine. And we also understand that for a lot of clinicians, oncologists, you may not have mechanism. That's also fine. So we are going to have different standards for different subfields. But the goal is to, by publishing papers in different spaces, to bring people together, to bridge the gap between discovery side and the clinical side, with the ultimate goal to understand cancer better, to have a better treatment. So to better do that, we did several things. One is that we just revamped our advisory board. So if you go to our website, you can see that exactly half of our advisory board PhD holders, and the other half either MD or MD PhD. So this reflects the scope of the journal. And two, we understand different fields may have different needs, different ways to revise their papers, for example, different standards. So we want to make ourselves available to the community. So if you're an author or potential author, if you want to talk with us, just send us an email. We will make ourselves available to talk with you at any time, to better understand your need, to better explain our view of your paper, to make the process as smooth, as productive as possible.
Thank you, Steve. Also, again, learn a few things and important, ways that you're considering to lead a cancer cell towards, which I think is very important for the audience. So thank you all for the introduction. It's unfortunate we can hear Ime, but that's just how it is. I'm sorry. And so I'll kick off with a question that I think many possibly will share with me as being important. So we discussed the fact that publishing is at the root also of the career of our junior colleagues. And these days there is a discussion as to whether we should post any data as soon as possible, even before it goes to proper peer review. And everybody's aware of the preprint server, bioRxiv, medRxiv, etc. And so I'll formulate my question around, what do you think about these and whether that impacts publishing in your journal? And I'll tie that to a second point, which is closely related, what sometimes is called the anti-scoop policy. So, many discoveries are driven by a long process. And sometimes when you submit, there is competition, and perhaps you have a paper that you have submitted and has gone through either peer review or partial peer review, and then something else comes out. And so I guess, and that's linked to preprint, of course, because you can post your paper now in 24 hours. So I don't know who wants to start, and whether who wants to pick it up from here. Raise your hands as we discussed in the warming up. Alexia, yes, thanks.
So preprints, yes. Preprints are a great thing. The nature journals actually have always liked preprints. We've always supported them and encouraged this deposition of preprints. Something that might not be well remembered is that we used to have our own Nature preprint server, Nature Proceedings, that was active from 2007 to 2012. And we have our whole physical science journal portfolio that have been working extremely closely with arXiv, the traditional preprint server in the physical sciences. So we encourage print deposition. It does not affect, as an editor, when I read a paper and I know that a similar preprint has been deposited, I don't consider the preprint to be affecting the advance of the paper that I'm intending to peer review. However, the authors, by submitting a preprint, can show to the public that their work pre-existed other publications. Preprints can be cited in our journals, and I just saw a cat go by. Sorry.
The reviewer. Sorry.
Yeah. Preprints can be cited in our papers, and that is not an issue. It's important for authors to remember or to think carefully of why they're citing these preprints and to support what claim, because citing a preprint to support a key claim of the paper might end up needing some additional support either with experiments or with a peer-reviewed publication, because we all recognize that preprints are not peer-reviewed. They can and do become further developed over time, and there are different versions that are deposited. So that is something for authors to remember. In terms of scooping protection, as I mentioned, we don't consider a preprint to be scooping a paper that we are considering for publication. We do realize that the preprint does, show that something is being already discussed in the field, but we don't think that that is affecting, how we would view the novelty of a paper that is submitted at the journal.
That was super clear, and I think super important. And we are starting to get many questions, which is fantastic, but this one is very important. So who else wants to contribute? I think we can go around and yeah, please go ahead, Sarah.
I would just reiterate what Alexia said. Preprints, they serve an important function. They do, as you say, get the work out early. And then as an individual scientist, they can serve a different function in terms of having a publishable unit. And historically, archive has been, for their fields, an important part of the review process, the development of a paper, and that's true for biology as well. So we have no issue, and we do encourage deposition of papers to preprint servers as well. It doesn't impact anything in terms of your editorial process at our journals. In terms of scoop policy, like broadly, not just with preprints, our journals don't have formal scoop policies. But before I was at Cell Reports Medicine, I was at Cell Reports, and I would say I've never in my editorial career rejected a paper because something came out in the meantime that was related to it. We've always found that there are differences in the papers and really supporting what was published previously, but not directly recapitulating it. So I would say there's at least at the reports, Cell Reports Medicine, kind of an informal scoop protection.
That was also a very clear message. 2 for 2. Anybody?
I think Yevgenia wants to jump in.
Oh, yep.
Yeah, so most of what I would say on this is the same things that Alexia and Sarah have already said in terms of us allowing preprints, allowing people to cite preprints, but not being scooped by preprints. And it's similar to what Sarah said in that if somebody's got a paper under review and something else comes out in the meantime, that's not going to change anything in terms of how we consider the paper. It's a different situation if a paper has been rejected and an author later wants to revise and resubmit it, but meanwhile something came out. Since that paper was not actively being considered in the meantime, then we start consideration all over again, and now there's something that scoops it. So that is a different situation.
That's also an important point to mention. But essentially, there is a consensus among all editors so far. I don't know who else wants to add to that.
Yeah, so we have a similar situation where we encourage preprint servers. We encourage authors to submit on preprint servers before they submit to us even. And for COVID-19 papers, we actually require them to submit to preprint servers. So that's something we're doing right now. In terms of scoop policy, we definitely have an anti-scoop policy during the review process, but the only thing that's different is if something is rejected and then authors submit a lot later, then we consider it as a new manuscript. So in this case, then we wouldn't have the same scoop protection, but yeah, in my experience in the journal so far, this hasn't really occurred. So yeah, like Sarah said, there are nuances with all of these papers. So we've never really had to consider that.
Very clear. And I think in a way, very reassuring for many of our junior colleagues. When we try to convey this, because we talk to you or discuss these things, they always kind of concerned that, something has come out and takes out of our work. I see Ime has tried again. Ime? Oh, I don't think so. Okay. We have. I don't know if anybody else wants to add. Otherwise, we got plenty of questions. Steve, do you want to add more, or Javier? Otherwise, we can ask additional questions.
I don't have anything to add to what Alexia said.
Okay. Okay.
Can we go from the chat, Alberto?
Yeah, from the chat that is filled in. So First question is, some journal editors have mentioned on Twitter that they don't have enough reviewers. How do you find reviewers, and what can we do to receive more invitation from our favorite journal? That's a good question, I would say.
Yeah.
Anybody wants to take it? Otherwise, we go around. Hey, Alexia.
Yeah, I can. I'm sure that my colleagues will agree with many of the things I will say. So, first of all, finding the right reviewers is the pillar of the editorial work, and getting the paper published and making sure that the paper gets fair and constructive, a fair and constructive process. So this is something very important to us. And we try continuously to keep our reviewer pool fresh and new. Before 2020 and COVID, going to conferences would have been, the best way to actually figure out who's who and meet the junior up and coming PIs, but also, the postdocs who are about to embark on their own independent careers. And actually, as an editor, that was part of the very exciting thing of going to conferences, interacting with people and figuring out who the next big stars would be. Another way is, of course, reading papers, and that's what we do for a living. So, I always pay attention not just to the senior list of I'm reading, through PubMed, but I also try to see who the first authors are, the people who drove the research in the lab. So that is another way. Another way, and there people like you, Alberto, and Caroline can also help editors, is through the recommendations of the PIs we do know and who might be more established. If we do contact you, for example, and you are not able to take on this review, it is great when we receive recommendations in terms of who you think are great people to contact in your area. We do like to see suggestions from authors. We permit this, it's not an issue. When you submit, you can send your list of suggested reviewers. We're not bound by such suggestions by any means, but it's actually also a good way to get us to know a few more people in different fields. And yeah, as I said, it's just a continuous process, and I'm sure each editor has their own different sort of ways of doing it. Something that doesn't happen as often is people getting in touch. Maybe it happens for other editors. I don't know, maybe I'm the exception. It doesn't happen to me very often, is people actually emailing me directly and saying, I'd like to review for your journal. It has happened, Twitter is a great place, most of the time. So it happens sometimes through Twitter, but if people are really interested in reviewing, they can, of course, get in touch. As I said, because it's a very important part of the process, we do want to find the right reviewers who will have the experience, who will have the knowledge. So, we do select independent investigators as reviewers. So someone who is pretty junior in their career, we would encourage them to co-review with their PI, for example, which is something that we do. And we say it in our invitation to review letters as well, that PIs are welcome to co-review with people from their lab, and we ask for the names of the co-reviewers to be provided as well, so we know who these reviewers are. Actually, an interesting initiative that has been launched by our reviews journals this year involves getting more, junior people to be part of the peer review process. So that is something that I'm watching with great interest, because it'd be nice to be able to get more junior people on board.
Yeah, Evgeny. And then Javier.
Overall, I feel like Alexia hit on most of the key points, because it sounds like the process is fairly similar for us. But one thing that I would add is that if you want to review more, to get noticed by the journals more, and you're just beginning your career, ask your senior colleagues, your PI, if you're not the PI of your lab, or other more senior colleagues who may be getting more review invitations than they can handle, to recommend you for the appropriate papers. Because if I send an invitation to someone and they recommend their more junior partner, and I look up that partner and see that they are in fact working in that area, I may potentially send them the paper to review. And then if I like their review, if they do a good job, then I'll be sending them invitations in the future. And that's how they get noticed and kind of get into the active pool.
Thank you. Very important. Javier.
Yeah, Alexia and Yevgenia touch on the main points. Indeed, looking for referees is where I spend most of the time when I'm handling a paper, because I feel is the most important part. You want to get reviewers that are familiarized with the topic, but see it at a certain distance so that they don't feel conflicted and are able to provide constructive criticisms. Just adding on what has been mentioned, we strive to promote diversity in our pool of referees and also gender balance, geographic balance, in order to promote kind of broad involvement of referees in our pool. And we also try to involve both senior scientists as well as more junior researchers who might be more familiarized sometimes with more technical aspects because they have more recently been at the bench. And we encourage more senior scientists to involve trainees and acknowledge their involvement, because in the future, and also when we recommend reviewers to our colleagues at other journals, we're going to give their names, and that is a way that they're going to be more and more involved in the review process, which I think, and I've been told, is also a learning process, especially for junior faculty as they advance in their careers.
Yes, sir. Just for everybody, we have more than 15 questions on the line, 16 now. Okay. So that's great. Now, but I was hoping for that. So that's great. And Caroline, you want to pick the next one, so you get ready for the next one.
Yeah. I'm ready.
Sarah.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. My colleagues have covered the important points. What I did want to add was something that's new at Cell Press. So STAR Protocols is a newer journal, and it's more technical, and so they're encouraging trainees to review for them and to contact them and be put in the reviewer pool. And what I have found is it's becoming a reviewer pool for technical reviewers for other Cell Press journals. So if I have, it's a very small part of a paper, but I need someone to evaluate a particular experiment or a particular technique, but I don't really need a full review from that individual, then that, this is an established pool of reviewers that we're going to. So for junior people, this can be a great way to kind of introduce yourself to the Cell Press family of journals and to get some experience reviewing papers.
Can you mention again the journal? I missed it.
STAR Protocols.
STAR Protocols. Okay, got it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Are we ready for the next one? Yeah.
Fire up, Caroline. Sure. Yeah.
So this is a bit of a controversial question, but I think it'll get us all going. So when is a rejection a true rejection, in inverted commas? Because most of the time, if you get a reject decision after extensive revisions, you might get it accepted. And I guess this is important if you're a new PI or a junior PI versus a seasoned campaigner. You hear on the gossip mill, well, so-and-so famous scientist got a reject, but he just went straight back to the editor and he had a fight and he got it in. Whereas if you're perhaps a new PI, and you probably wouldn't go down that road. So how do you make clear to the PIs or the senior authors of a paper, when you say reject, you really mean reject? Evgenia.
So to me, the key thing is, why was it rejected? So you can look at the comments of the reviewers, and it depends on whether it's an editorial call versus a true scientific one, and whether there's any reviewer error. Certainly if there was reviewer error that's demonstrable, for example, the reviewer is mistaken about something you showed in the paper, or the reviewer misunderstands and miscites something from the literature, and that's a major enough error that it affected the decision, by all means that's grounds for an appeal. Or for that matter, editor error, though we try to avoid that. But yeah, and so reviewer error, or if it's an argument about, for example, something like novelty, where that's something that can be debated, and I can see how people may argue about that. Well, is my paper novel enough? Is it enough of an advance over something that's been published? That's something relatively arguable. But if there are some type of critical experimental flaws or some sort of scientific reason why the paper is not acceptable, or for that matter, for a translational journal like ours, let's say you've done a bunch of revisions and you've done the best you could, but then you found out that your new drug doesn't work. Well, there's not much we can do about that necessarily in a translational journal. So that may be harder or impossible to appeal. And I find that while a lot of people try to appeal And there are certain people that you know they will appeal everything. The vast majority of the time, that just delays their paper. And a lot of times it just ends up being dragged through extra cycles of revision and review and then not making it through anyway. So we try to be reasonable from our editorial standpoint and look at the paper and say, what are the chances that this will realistically make it through review or through re-review, and reject it if it's not likely to make it, rather than keep delaying the process. So we recommend that before you appeal, you look carefully as to whether you really do have a strong case, such as, again, reviewer error or something that can be reasonably debated, as opposed to drug just doesn't work.
Thank you. Anybody else want to tackle that one? Looks like, oh, Alexia?
Well, what I definitely agree with Evgenia, that the question is, why was the paper rejected? So if we're talking about an editorial rejection, there you have the opinion of the editor as to whether the paper is, in scope for the journal, is novel enough for that journal, or well developed enough for that journal. So I can say that the majority of appeals that we receive on editorial rejections, we uphold these decisions because we make, the best effort to provide clear decisions that are well justified as well. That doesn't mean that we're not open to discuss and hear the author's perspective, but we don't want to be stringing people along and sending something out for review. When I feel I cannot champion this paper, I will make it clear to the author, because then it wastes everybody's time. Post-review, it's interesting because it's not that, what you said before, that a paper might come back after revision. Well, the authors might revise after having been rejected and the paper will go in. In those cases, in my experience, it means that the points that were raised by the referees, that for that data set that was peer reviewed, they were killer points, or they might have required very extensive revisions. Now the authors have managed to address it. So as editors, we don't just look at, level of advance and, how many experiments a revision would require. We also look at how long the authors would have to engage in a revision. So if I think as an editor that you might have to go back to the bench for a year, I am not gonna tie you into this process. However, because we don't know what researchers are doing in their labs and through their collaborations at any given time, it can happen, for example, that some experiments were well underway, or it was easier to address things than we originally thought. And the final thing I'd like to say is that a rejection, at least when it's coming from my desk, it's a rejection. It means that we don't think this is going to proceed. But it's an open discussion always in science, because the author might have arguments and explanations and revisions that I'm not aware of, and that is why we have the appeal process. So it's not really that we pick up the phone and an author argues against the decision. It's that we're presented with new information that modify that decision.
Perfect. Anyone else want to jump in there? That was a really clear. Thank you both, Evgenia and Alexia. That was really helpful. No? Alberto?
I'll pick the next one. I'm trying to select now from those that come, I think, from the more junior people, because that's what this is also meant to be. And so I like very much this question. What advice would you offer to PhD student, early career researcher, in terms of writing a manuscript and increasing their chances of publication? It seems a very general question, but I think because it comes from a junior trainee, I think it's worth addressing it. And again, what would you offer to increase the chance? Evgenia again. Yeah.
It's a little bit difficult for me to tell whether you are asking about the scientific part or the writing part. In terms of the scientific part, that's something that's trickier for us to say, because obviously you have to try to look for an exciting project with an interesting direction, etc. And there's only so much that we can say about that. But from the writing and editorial viewpoint, I would say that one of the biggest things to help you get your paper across is ensuring readability. So run it by other students, maybe even not in your lab, or even ones in a different part of biology, etc., to try to make sure that people can understand what it is you're writing. A lot of times I find that authors, especially ones who are focused on a narrow topic and maybe don't have the breadth of perspective, write in a way that's clear to somebody who's working on the exact topic that they are, but may be difficult for a general reader or a general editor to appreciate in terms of its significance, its broad relevance, etc., and can also be difficult to follow if they are jumping from one idea to another where the connections are obvious to them, but not to somebody outside the field. So ensuring this sort of clear flow and explanation for somebody who's not in exactly your subfield is very helpful.
Javier, yeah.
I would also add that it's important to know your work and how does it fit within the landscape and also the journals available. It doesn't mean that because you're very excited, obviously, for your work that is going to make it to a top-tier journal. So I think, or a different journal. I think it's important that you know the journals, that you become familiarized with the editorial scopes. Readability, it's obviously an important point. One example that, or one general advice that I generally give to trainees as they write their papers is to look where does the literature that they cite gets featured on, because that might be a reflection of a journal which scope might fit better with their work. And another point that I would emphasize, and I can never emphasize it enough, is the importance of the cover letter. That is a key point that might go undervalued when thinking about submitting a paper, but it's something that we really put much attention on, because it's kind of the 5 minutes you have on an informal talk with an editor to really explain your work. No need to go into technicalities or sophisticated phrases. It's just a way to convey why my work is important, how it advances the field, and why do I think it fits within the journal. So that would be another point that I would emphasize.
So related to that, I'd like to expand, trying to interpret what the PhD student was saying. So I think he or she might be asking whether you consider more important the message or how it is written. It's difficult to explain this, but I think because I sometimes advise that if the science is super good, but you cannot convey your message, then it's going to be more difficult to get in, even if the science is exciting. But I wanted to get your. I hope I interpreted that correctly. I think Alexia wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think that is a very good point. It's an excellent point, and I think there's a distinction between how an editor would look at the paper on their desk, how a referee would look at it, and how the reader will look at it. So as an editor, I mean, of course, everybody likes reading a clearly written, beautifully written story. But as an editor, I'll be looking at the data primarily. So if the paper is not well written in terms of structure or even in terms of English, language, that is not going to factor in my decision because I'm looking at the data and what the data set is telling me. And the referee, to a large degree, is looking at that. But for a referee, it's important to make their lives as easy as you can as an author, so that it's easy for them to follow the story and understand the data well. But then for the reader, you want to entice the reader, you want to interest the reader. Think of how we discover the papers we read. We go on PubMed, we put some keywords there, and then we screen many titles, and then pick the interesting ones and click to read the abstract. And then out of those, read only a few of the papers. So you want to capture your audience. So clarity is very important of your message, looking at your data set and thinking of what is the story here. So my advice would be don't follow the chronological order in which you gathered the data unless that makes sense for the story you're trying to tell. On the flip side, I would say that you also don't want to overhype things. So don't look for a beautiful story, with a neatly tied bow. So you want to actually be clear and honest about what conclusions you can reach with your data, but you want to avoid being super dry about the descriptions. You want to put the data into context. So a good introduction, putting the question in context. What are we trying to address? Leading into a well-structured, results section, and then a well thought out discussion that doesn't overhype the findings, that again discusses the findings in the context of the literature, but explains to me, why should I be excited? You want to excite your editor in the first instance. You want to interest the referees, and then you want to capture your audience. So this would be my advice. The other thing would be to avoid vagueness, especially in titles and abstracts. So, provide a title that is a statement, avoid vague words like regulates, say promotes or inhibits. And then the abstract is very important. It's kind of like the face of your paper is the title and the abstract. So if that is well written, it predisposes people, in a certain way to read your paper. And my final thing is, as you're writing the paper, it's very important to give your draft to people who are not directly in your field, your lab mates, because they might be too close. Give it to someone else who will be able to advise you from a bit more, distance.
Yeah.
Okay, I have another one coming up. Thank you. That was really useful. This
also
is,
for
this
me.
Is, this is another question that I get from folks quite often as well when we're talking about, you get your paper and the first sentence, you get it back and the first sentence says, this is a really interesting topic. The paper is acceptable if, and then there's about 5 pages of things you must do. And some of them you can do, and some of them you're not quite sure whether you can do. And how much advice do you give that sort of interprets what the reviewers want? So you need to say, well, there's 5 comments from reviewer 4. If you really need to address number 2 and number 4, do you guide us a little bit more now when you see these huge reviews with lots and lots of questions and requests? I see, Roshan, you're nodding. You're going to open that one?
So we do try to guide authors in our letters after we receive the reviews and interpret kind of what are the most important things that we see reviewers request that would allow it to be publishable in genome medicine. So we really do guide authors. We also welcome authors to contact us. So if you contact us and say, realistically, I can only do 2 of these 3 things, or especially in this era of COVID-19 where authors can't be in their labs, they can't be doing revisions that involve intense experimentation right now. So we're definitely open to authors asking us that, and open to interpreting these reviewers' comments.
Any other? Steve, did you want to come in on that one?
Yes, so I'm a strong believer of editorial communication. I think it's very important because right now we don't want to waste our times on dotting every I's, crossing every T's. Although in some occasions it is important, but most of the time we do want to give the author the intellectual freedom to decide which direction they want to go, because the paper is probably already very exciting. It can open up doors in several directions. So different reviewers with different expertise may suggest different things. And I just don't think that's fair to the authors to cover everything. So that's why for every revision letter we send out from Cancer Cell, we make it very clear to the authors what are the things we think are the most important. Sometimes we tell the authors that here are the 3 directions you could go, and you can pick one. Sometimes we tell the authors, here are the 2 things that we think are very critical you have to address. So with this customized revision letters, we believe that will help authors to prioritize their time and resource. And to make it more effective, we request authors to contact us to discuss with us about their revisions after they digest reviewers' comments. And we actually enjoy that process. Although many times we cannot tell you what exactly experiments you need to do, but we can explain to you what we think this reviewers is asking.
Steve, sorry, pause 1 second. Operator, you have your mic open. Operator, could you close your microphone? Sorry, Steve, please go ahead.
Yeah, so by sending out these customized revision letters and by talking with authors to get on the same page, we believe that will really streamline and make the revision process as smooth as possible.
Thank you. I think the operator is still not on mute. There we go. That's better.
No, I think they don't hear us. I just okay,
Yeah,
they're muted.
we're good now. Okay.
If are there any more comments on this? Otherwise, I'll move on. I found another question that I really like. Oh no, Evgeny. Sorry, Alexia. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just be very quick. So for every invitation to revise that we send from Nature Cancer, the authors will get a list of prioritized points that the editor has curated, in which we have synthesized the key points that we think must be addressed for the paper to be successful at our journal. Whenever we think it is possible, we also have a list of overruled points editorially. So the points, we look at the reports critically, and we try to see whether there are points that are not essential, beyond the scope of this story, or not feasible, or something that might be great but will take you 2 years and add a little to the paper. And we do that. And as Steve said as well, we invite authors to get back in touch with us if they think that something we have prioritized is not feasible or would be uninterpretable.
Oh, yeah.
And a very, very quick practical point. Indeed, when authors plan to get in touch with the editor to discuss the revisions, my suggestion is that the sooner the better, because we have read the paper in very thorough detail, the referees' comments, and we have it fresh in our minds what the paper is about, what it would take to revise it. So the sooner the authors get in touch with us to discuss the paper, the more effective the discussion will be, rather than if it happens after 1 month that we have kind of moved on to other papers and we need to revisit the file and so on. My suggestion is to do it as soon as possible.
I see that there may be great news. I think you may have found a way to connect. Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
Welcome. So glad to have you.
Thank you. It only took 3 devices, so that's awesome.
That's fine. That's part of the fun. Sorry about that.
Oh no, I'm sorry. But
what I propose is that you now take. We were in the middle of 2 questions anyway. If you don't mind introducing your journal, and then we'll go forward. Yeah.
Sure, I'll just make it super quick. So my name is EACR. I'm a senior editor at Cancer Discovery. Thank you for your patience. And Cancer Discovery is one of the journals published by the EACR, which is the American counterpart to the EACR. So hello, cousins. Cancer Discovery is, the scope of the Cancer Discovery is basically major advances in cancer research and medicine. And our interests lay from bench to bedside, essentially, and everything in between. So we're, interested in, high impact, major advances in anything from very basic research to science-driven, hypothesis-driven clinical trials. We also aim to serve the community by providing the latest news, reviews, and commentaries on publications that we think are very important, that have been published in other journals such as Nature Medicine and some of our colleagues sitting around this panel. And some of the research, so our setup is that we have a couple of EICs and 2 EICs, one representing the basic research side and one the clinical side, and a group of in-house professional editors. And our structure is a little unique in that our EICs are very involved in our decision-making process. So recently we welcomed Luis Diaz as one of our EICs and Bob Kruger as our senior executive editor. Sorry, I know I just did the flow, but
no, that was very good. Anytime. And if you heard a previous question and you want to address anything now, feel free. Otherwise, I'll read out the next one and then we can go about as we've done so far.
Sure, I think that'll probably be better because.
Okay, so I think this comes from a junior, again, trainee. We are sometimes asked for the first time to be referees. What would you like to see in a good peer reviewer? And what would you seek in a good reviewer? Evgeny.
The biggest thing that I look for in a reviewer or in a good review is actually similar to what was asked from the editors last time. In other words, some clarity as to what experiments are actually essential to convey the main point of the paper and to solidify the conclusions, and which ones are just, well, it would be nice, or which ones are taking the paper in new directions. So it's good when a reviewer is thorough and looks at all parts of the paper, but then doesn't just say, what would I want to find out about next, but instead focuses on what would make this paper as convincing as possible and what would make the data as solid as possible. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an insanely long review. Like a 5-page review doesn't necessarily help anyone, and you don't need to point out every typo in the paper. That's our job. Instead, we need you to focus on the science part. And again, especially the key experiments. And if you do like the paper and don't feel like it needs a lot of experiments, that if you like it that much, which occasionally happens, it's okay. But then you need to make it clear to us that you've read it. So summarize it, explain why you like it or what's strong about it. Because if you write a 2-liner just saying, hey, this is a very nice paper in a cool area, that doesn't really tell us that you paid attention to it.
Thanks. That's very helpful. Anybody who wants to add to what it takes what you would like to see in a good review?
I agree with all your points, actually. And yeah, it's very important, even if you like the paper, you have no recommendations, just to outline exactly what it is you like, why it's an advance, what you think is good about it, how the experiments are nuanced. These are all very helpful. And if you have recommendations, it is important to look sometimes a little bit more big picture than obviously typos and small things. So if you have a list of major recommendations, I would advise that you kind of separate those out into major and minor, and kind of which ones are just something that you would like to see that would make this more of an advance, and which ones are critical to have it published.
So this very important advice. So essentially mirroring what Evgenia said, you would like then to see exactly from the reviewer as well as these being critical to try overcome a threshold, basically. Also from the reviewer side. Okay, that's very good advice. Okay.
Also for overly negative reports, it would be very nice if even overly negative reports, you could go through exactly what it is that's negative instead of being just like, this is terrible or something.
Yeah.
Politely.
Really detailed reports.
Yeah, exactly. Politeness.
Yeah.
I think there are, everybody's online, so I don't see all faces. So if Sarah, you raised your hand, I didn't see you because you're in there. But
I did, and I don't have much to add. Everybody's covered it quite nicely. So I would reiterate the importance of a summary. It is important to provide that so that you know that you and the authors are on the same page in terms of what the paper is, and then focusing on the paper that you have and not the paper that you wish it would be, to be constructive, and then also to make sure there's not a disconnect in what you're communicating to the editors and the authors. Sometimes you'll provide comments for the authors that are seem relatively minor, that for them this is a minor revision, but you've communicated in email or otherwise to the editors that absolutely no for this paper. What you tell the author should really reflect what you're telling the editors. It can be very hard to communicate with the authors if there is that disconnect. So
can I add one point regarding the literature? So it's important for reviewers to also say what they think the paper is adding to the literature. So if the referee has concerns that this is not novel enough, we knew this already, this is kind of a useless document for a editor unless you cite the relevant literature and you mention which papers you mean, so that we can actually go and look at these papers and assess your comments. Equally though, it's important to actually support these statements well. So, not listing 10 papers that just mention, this protein in a different context, in a different setting. The point of a peer review is not to kill a paper. The easiest thing is to kill a paper. You can find reasons always to be negative. The point is to provide a constructive comment as a referee, and also a constructive process as an editor. And to that, I would add what I want to see by referees and by authors as well is a constructive and civilized and polite tone in their reports, in their rebuttals. It goes a long way to make the process much better.
You're conveying a very important point. I can imagine. Any further to that? If not, either Caroline or me will pick the next one. Caroline, you want to go?
I think it's my turn. So I was going to really roll two questions together. One is where, let's say you have 4 referees and they don't agree with each other. 2 say yes, 2 say no. And then how do you deal with that? And how do you make it so that it doesn't take forever to get back to the authors? Who wants that one?
Sure.
Sarah.
I mean, I'm going to say it's rare that the reviewers are in complete agreement. They're looking at the paper from different perspectives. You don't bring on, a set of reviewers that are looking at this from an identical professional or technical or scientific perspective. So, it comes back to what we said earlier around revising and appealing. It's what was their perspective? What were they looking at? Is it an experiment or is it the full field? And so you kind of prioritize reviewer comments. You kind of prioritize reviewers in a sense in that way. You're never counting votes, I would say. Like, it's not 2 people are positive and 1 is negative. So this is positive. You really look at what they're asking for, what the paper is, what the field is, and going from there. So you're always moderating disagreements and revisions can take different trajectories based on reviewer comments, and so it is a conversation effectively.
Yeah.
I would add to that it also, in the eyes of an editor, it depends on what are the key points in relation to the scope of the journal. For us, for example, it might be that a referee lists as a limitation lack of mechanistic depth, which might be a fair comment to say, but if our interest in the paper is on the clinical impact, because it showcases the efficacy of a given therapy, we are not going to make our decision, or we are not going to consider the lack of mechanistic depth as a limiting factor, as long as the main point that is of interest to us is sufficiently supported. So it also depends on what journal you are targeting and what is the core of their scope.
Thank you. Any other points on that with disagreeing referees' comments?
I just wanted to point out this is especially important for kind of multidisciplinary papers where you may have reviewers that don't cover each particular aspect of your paper. So you might have someone in microbiome and someone in cancer primarily, and with maybe one person overlapping. So this is also something we have to take into consideration when we have reviewers covering different subjects. And perhaps if there is one overly negative reviewer, we may need to get kind of an editorial board opinion on that one topic. That is a consideration that we take.
Thank you, Evgenia.
In some cases, if the reviewers really are from the, to add to what was said already, if there are cases where the reviewers, 1 or 2 of them really do seem particularly negative, or if there are reviewers who cover the same area but have completely opposite viewpoints, in some cases we may even ask them to comment on each other's reviews in something that's called cross review. We don't do it that often. Science does it more routinely than we do. We do it only in these types of selected cases, but regardless, we try to make sure it does not add appreciably to the length of time that something is reviewed, as Dr. Dive pointed out. So when we send a paper to cross review, we ask the reviewers to get their comments back to us in 2 or 3 days. And typically that's feasible because they just reviewed the paper. It's still fresh in their mind, so they can take a look at the other reviewers' comments and see what they think. And that can go both ways. In some cases, the positive reviewers look at the negative ones and say, those are good points. I haven't thought of that. Actually, the paper's not as good as I thought. Or it can go the other way and they can say, that review is overly critical, and this is why I don't think those negative comments are fair to the paper. So can go in the author's favor or vice versa.
Yep.
So,
no.
Okay.
Ime, you have something to say? Yep.
Yeah, I actually have to add on to everybody else's comments, and as a corollary to Evgenia's comments just now, if as she said, the outcome is that the reviewers in a similar field remain firmly opposed. I think that's when, as editors, we step in and editorially decide, as long as it's not a fatal flaw, if it's just a matter of opinion, of basically glass half full, glass half empty, then we editorially step in and decide, if as editors, how strongly we feel about the paper and the interest that it would, how it would fit in our journal and how it would fit with our audience's interests. So we, at that point, we have that option as well.
Okay. I got a question that is very critical, but I think it's good to raise it. And we'll take the direction of the discussion possibly somewhere else. So it starts off with, should science be based in cooperation or in competition? So journal, even from different editorial group, collaborate or compete with each other? What would be the appropriate balance among these options, and how can we move in the right direction? How do you see the future cancer research in terms of the way of communicating discoveries? And many thanks for participating, etc. I would, I think that, it's critical, but it's good to hear your voices on this, because I think the community is probably wondering whether, this is the right way for the future. It always has to be a little bit in silos. Can there be a process? I don't know, maybe some of you have thought about that. Some groups have thought about that. I don't know if you could comment. Yeah, Alexa.
I'll say that, I think that on this panel, I have some of my favorite colleagues, from different journals. I think that we're all trying to do something good for this field. So, I come from the Nature journals, and so does Javier, and Ime comes from Cancer Discovery, and Steve from Cancer Cell, for example. That doesn't mean we're like at each other's throats, and competing, head to head. We're all trying to publish great science and provide, a good editorial process and make sure that the science gets out quickly. The authors have many choices, which I think is a good thing. Do we collaborate between journals from different publishing houses? Right now, we don't have a lot of that. We do collaborate and we do work together when it comes to journals from the same publishing house, like Javier and me and many other colleagues in the Nature journals. We work closely together. I think there are initiatives that are trying to get more collaboration between publishing houses, and that is interesting, when it comes to portable peer review, for example. So there are efforts out there to do this. From my perspective, that's a good thing. I mean, we're all working towards, the same goal. And I think we'll see more and more of that. I think that in our areas in the life sciences, when we rediscovered preprints a few years ago, it sort of spurred things a little bit more in terms of openness and more discussion and more comments. So, we'll see things happening in this space, I'm sure.
Thank you. That's thoughtful. And it's going to be interesting which direction the publishing will take. I think Evgenia wanted to speak as well. Yeah.
Much of what I wanted to say, Alexei already covered. We seem to be on the same wavelength today. Yeah. But one thing I would add in terms of cooperation versus competition from the author's side, as opposed to from the editor's side, is that I definitely prefer the cooperation side. And what I mean by that is that if two people are working on competing projects, I try to, if I happen to find out or if they find out about each other, I encourage them to co-submit the papers, because that way, instead of them rushing to try to beat each other's papers out and maybe shortcutting key experiments and just trying to get something out there in different journals, they can instead try to strengthen and reinforce each other's papers, because if they are being reviewed together, published together, they reinforce the message, they show that it's reproducible, and then they can calmly do the needed experiments so that the story is as convincing as possible.
Okay, are we ready for the next one? We've only got another 15 to 20 minutes, so I just want to make sure we can try and get through as many as possible. But this one is really about careers, and I think it's come from a young scientist. So if you're interested in an editorial career, how essential is a postdoc? What additional experiences during your PhD would prepare you the best? And I guess to add to that, what are you looking for on a CV when it comes in and you're recruiting for your journal? Evgenia, do you want to kick off?
So for us, we do require at least some postdoctoral experience, but the things we look for are more than just laboratory experience, but breadth of interest and a demonstrated interest in editing, writing, and basically the things that would be needed for an editorial career. So it's one thing if you just wrote one paper or even 3 papers that you published as a first author, and a very different thing if you're the one who's informally reviewing your colleagues' papers, if you're participating in a student publication that you're helping edit and things like that. And by the way, I know that some others have mentioned open positions. We actually have an open position right now for an immunology editor, which could be cancer immunology. So if some of you postdocs out there are interested, it's there.
Okay, anyone else want to? I think Javier, you wanted to join in there?
Yeah, I agree. For us, we also, all the editors in our group have PhD and postdoctoral experience, because I guess that reflects that you have been exposed to different fields of research, and that has given you a broader view of the research area. I would say that also we do look at the scientific background, research background of candidates when we look for their CV, but it's very important also to look at their interests, which is reflected on the interviews. And I think also personal skills are a very important consideration, because these the job of an editor involves a lot going to conferences, interacting with the community, and that requires being proactive, outgoing, and so on. So that is another aspect that I would emphasize.
Thank you. Steve, did you want to join this discussion?
I think it's covered. So basically, there are 2 types of professional editors. One is on the review journals. So for those journal editors, you probably have to write and edit more. And another is just for primary research journals. So you handle manuscripts. So there's slightly different kind of expertise required. But nevertheless, a strong communication skill, verbal and written, will be very helpful. So I would suggest, if you're a grad student or postdocs, go to as many talks as you can, even outside of your research field, to broaden your horizon, and also go to as many meetings as you can to meet people from different areas and to talk with them, to to practice your communication skills.
Thank you. Anyone else want to talk about careers?
I just wanted to say something. First of all, I am looking for an editor right now. So if people are interested, send me an email. I'd love to hear from you, as we're expanding our team as well soon. So
as you can see, the editors are not competing, of course not.
No.
Different profiles.
Actually, something that Javier touched on, having a postdoc, usually what that reflects is that you've been exposed to more science from different sides. That doesn't mean it's a must-do, for an editorial career. So in my team, everybody has postdoc experience, but I actually know colleagues who went into editorial careers directly from their PhD. Some of them are chief editors now. So really, the question is, how much do you know, and how interested are you, for science in your field? So do not be deterred by trying for an editorial career if you don't have a postdoc.
Thank you. I'm sure that's a few sighs of relief in the audience now. Roshan, did you want to say more?
Alexia, thank you for saying that, because I actually don't have a postdoc, so you don't need a postdoc. I came straight from my PhD, and I think what was really looked at for me was just that I had a really broad interest in all of science. So I think for a broad scope, broad interest journal, that's what we're looking for. And also the points that Javier mentioned, pretty much that we want you to be outgoing, to go to conferences, to talk to different researchers, to not be afraid to get into discussions. So those kind of qualities in an editor.
Amy, did you want to add anything from Cancer Discovery?
Sure. So we actually span the whole gamut. Some of us were in the bench for quite a while, and others came pretty much directly from PhD. So I think we covered all the bases that everyone else has touched upon. But, I would also add that, this is a great way for, if you feel like you've been specializing very much in, you do tend to become kind of, hemmed in by your graduate student project or whatever. But now this is the chance to expand your horizons and, really. So as Steve says, go to multiple talks, go to journal clubs. I think our ed meetings pretty much sound like journal clubs every day, right? And so this is a chance for you to just really expand your horizons and get like a higher level view of the field. So I also recommend, along the lines of everyone else, just keep reading, and even on your own, just keep reading, reading outside of your area, your current area of interest.
Perfect. Sarah, did you want to add anything? We've had a good discussion on this.
Sorry, was that to me? No, I think everybody has covered, communication, breadth, all of these things are super important. I would just add that, if breadth is also something you should like. So yes, it's something that we're looking for in your application and in your process. But if you really don't like to think broadly about science, and this consider that, and whether editorial is something that you'd actually be interested in. That comfort with broad, with different fields and the breadth within your own field is very obvious as you move through the process. So whether you like it or not is also pretty obvious.
Thank you. Back to you, Alberto.
Okay, another one. I like the critical one. So it starts off in a very harsh way. You all are, in some sense, gatekeepers on whether our research work receives broader attention in the community, which I would, as a moderator, say no longer true, possibly because there is the possibility to post your paper anytime on preprints. But nevertheless, it keeps going, which I think is interesting. Do you think the reviewer comments are getting more demanding? Nowadays, it's common to receive pages and pages. We heard that. Part of the reason being that every review employs many individuals from their group to provide comments. And I make a disclosure. Sometimes it does happen to me, and I disclose it because, for example, bioinformaticians are needed sometimes. So in essence, a paper is being reviewed by, say, 10 people instead of 3 that are officially cited. That can be addressed, I guess, and this could be a question to all of you. Are there any tips to navigate the situation? And the rest is similar to previous question that we asked. But I think what this boils down is very often now a paper as multidisciplinary, right? And so when a paper is sent to me for review, for example, I have to say that the computational part, if it is a part of it, I ask someone else to do. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, but it's very common in my case, at least. Yeah.
I can say that is true. I think the longer comments and the more complex reports are due to the papers being more complex and multidisciplinary. You look at what would have been published as a cancer paper 20 years ago, and it didn't have the technology, didn't have the breadth, the clinical data, the very detailed mechanism. Now we have papers that have all of this. So as an editor, we need to cover these aspects of the paper. So we go to researchers who can comment on these topics, and they will send us their lengthy list. I think what we said before about what points go to the heart of the paper, what is essential, what is the killer point, the make or break of the paper. That is what we look at as editors. And that when I said we prioritize points, these would be the points we prioritize. The technical points that they must be resolved because they are technical, it's essential for the data set to be strong. And then we would overrule on the peripheral things, the interesting to find out. It would be nice to know, or, questions that take the paper to a whole different direction. And something that Javier mentioned before that I think is very important is that each journal looks at the paper from their own scope, their own perspective. So a referee might send a long report listing all these points, but for the paper to make it in Nature Cancer, many of these might not be essential. So I see ourselves as editors as, active parts of the process, not passive filters to just, forward referee comments. We actually curate them and help the authors. And that's why we're saying before, it's important to get in touch with your editors if you have questions about what is essential and what isn't.
Very clear. We're getting exhausted. I am. We have been talking for nearly 90 minutes, and it's been going very fast.
I think there's one more, Alberto, which I think is a really interesting question, and it's what is your opinion about having double-blind review, where the reviewers don't see the authors' names? Because I think this is a really interesting question. Why wouldn't you do that?
We have that at the Nature journals. We started this as an option years ago now. I would say we did it because this was consistently one of the topics raised by authors whenever we went to conferences, that, you know, we need to have this. And I was very curious to see what would happen when we had it. I can say that it has not been picked up by many authors, actually. It's a very, very low number of authors who opt into double-blind peer review, like in the range of 10% across our journals. So it hasn't really made a difference or a big splash. I think part of it might be that it's quite hard for the author to anonymize their paper, because even if you don't write in the form that we discovered, your reference list will, you know, show
the game away.
Exactly. I mean, even if it's not you, it might be someone who was from your lab or from your group of collaborators. So that is hard. I will say something positive. Something that we were concerned about as editors was whether that would affect the peer review process. Like, would referees suddenly say, I don't know who these authors are, I don't want to review. And then it would be harder for us to provide a good process, you know, by getting, you know, the people we wanted as referees. It hasn't made a difference in that respect. I haven't had any referees decline to review because of double blind. So I think the field is open to this, whether the name of the author is there or not. I just, what I've seen based on the numbers is that it hasn't really changed things as much as we might have thought before we rolled it out.
Interesting.
An interesting thing would be if it was mandatory, you know, and everybody had to anonymize, then, you know, it might be something entirely different, but we don't have that yet. So,
Steve, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, so I just want to say, I think the reason asking this question is, you know, probably because of the fear of being discriminated against, because you're not a famous established lab coming from an established lab. So I think I can assure our audience that the vast majority of our reviewers do not review your papers this way. So they review your papers not to try to kill a paper, just like what we read a paper. We're not trying to kill the paper. We're trying to see what is the most interesting points of the paper. And then the reviewers the same way. They spend a lot of time on reading your paper, on providing suggestions. So they're trying to make the paper better, to improve it. I think that's the mentality of the majority of the reviewers. So if you understand that, I think making it double-blind may not be that critical. That being said, everyone has implicit bias. So that's why we have multiple people. That's why I think Javier mentioned that every journal is trying to expand to you know, keep diversity in mind when we invite reviewers, to try to have a different perspectives. And also for editors, I think for all the journals that I have worked with, we all discuss the papers as a team. That's another way to try to eliminate bias, to make you know, as fair decision as possible.
Thank you very much. That's helpful.
I think it's time to wrap this up. But this has been amazing. Literally, I want to convey our deepest appreciation for being here, openly discuss with all these junior people that were really interested. I just wanted to make sure that possibly there could be a way that one could incorporate these into a paper. It's weird, but you know, some of the things that were said today are not obvious. I can assure you, even among my trainees. And so, you know, I think you said those, and I think reiterated. And the other thing which I love is that there is wide sort of convergence in the way you think about double-blind, about openness, about reviewing, about scooping, about bioarchive, which is remarkable because, you know, you're a community obviously as well. The last thing, and Caroline should add, is whether you wanted to say something in the last 2 minutes that we didn't cover that you would like to disseminate to the audience. Perhaps we forgot something, or otherwise, I think it's just beautiful. Yeah.
I would just briefly add, and following on one of the last questions that was asked, that we would like, or it is our intention, not to be perceived as gatekeepers, but as partners in the publishing process, because publishing is one of the parts of the research process, and we would like to be, and it is our intention to enable that last part. So we strive in our day-to-day work to convey that message and to really help a paper to be the best it can be and to find the best and most appropriate home for it to reach their community.
Okay.
Yeah, I would echo that, and just say we don't want any part of this to be a mystery. So if you have questions about the journal, what happens to your paper, about the process, just contact us. We're happy to talk to you at any stage, and it's easy to find us online. So don't hesitate.
So
there we go. Every editor nodding their head in unison. What a perfect way to end.